you winning, son?
Over the last few years, there has been a large resurgence of electronic music, finally seeing the scene break past the milquetoast and boring EDM that we become accustomed to, all thanks to artists like NanoRay, Baitu, Kaizo Slumber, and Machine Girl. We've not only seen a return, but a renaissance of long-dormant genres such as IDM, techno, breakcore, and especially drum and bass. Although, there's one name in particular who has been a huge catalyst for this renaissance: Sewerslvt. A name that's become incredibly big over the last few years in both its adoration and its infamy. A crushing electronic artist from Australia, Sewerslvt, or Junko as her fans know her, is an artist who fuses drum and bass, breakcore, noise, industrial, and shoegaze all into a cauldron to create some of the most distinctly melancholic and somber sounds you can find in music today. Also, they're one of my favorites. So let's talk about Sewerslvt and how I learned to love drowning in the sewer. Sewerslvt started out under the name Sad Boy Sheldon, making death grips mashups and remixes. These have since been taken down, but were very popular and instrumental in helping her obtain the first wave of following that would later come. These mashups were also accompanied by a needlessly controversial album under the name on second thought, maybe I shouldn't say that. It was a collection of mashups that might share the chaos of the later Sewerslvt music, but in tone, they sounded nothing alike. If anything, it was just shitposting in music form, and
it sucks playing the shit!
That's about as much as I really want to go into the project. If you're curious, you can find re-uploads, but it's nothing really worth your time. That being said, it was after this that Junko adopted the moniker and became Sewerslvt, releasing the album Don't Be Afraid of Dying, a very somber trap hip-hop project that contained elements of vaporwave and also introduced the noise and ambient elements that would later come to define Junko's signature sound. Don't Be Afraid of Dying is another one of those records that has been scrubbed from the official Bandcamp and YouTube pages, but it's easy to find if you want to listen to it. I could only imagine that Junko felt the project wasn't representative of the sound that they would inevitably go after. But in my personal opinion, it's a great starter piece and is a cool way of seeing just how far Sewerslvt has grown as a songwriter. Don't Be Afraid of Dying is also where we can see the beginnings of Junko's personality really shine through. Outside of the meme-laden Sad Boy Sheldon project, it's here where we are introduced to samples that seem more personal to the producer. Things like My Life as a Teenage Robot, Akira, Legend of Zelda, Crystal Castles, Clams Casino, Silent Hill. We can go on, but you get the idea. We can also see the beginnings of Sewerslvt's obsession with the real-life person Junko Furuta, whose name can be spelled with the first letter of each song on the album. All of this would later become a staple of the Sewerslvt aesthetic, something that is integral to the experience of the music itself. I think now is a good time to talk about the great big elephant in the room, and that's the callous edginess of the entire project. Sewerslvt is not an artist for the faint of heart, and has been controversial for far more than just the use of a slur as an album title years ago. Self-harm, schizophrenia, rape, child death, and suicide are consistent themes and imagery that pop up across everything Sewerslvt makes. The name Junko itself comes from the aforementioned Junko Furuta. Furuta being the tragic victim of one of Japan's most well-known true crime stories. I won't go into detail, but the Cliff Notes version is this. Junko Furuta was a 17-year-old who was kidnapped by a young gang member who had ties to the Yakuza. Due to this, no real intervention was made out of fear of retaliation from the Yakuza. Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Shiniki Minato, and Yusashi Watanabe were the perpetrators of this crime, kidnapping, raping, and torturing Junko for months until they later killed her, chopped her up, and encased her in a barrel of concrete and disposed of the body until they were later found out by the police, though justice never truly was served and then were given very little time for their unspeakable crimes. And it's just a tragic tale. If you're curious and you want to know more, there are documentaries and multiple films based off the story that goes into far greater detail than what I have here. Now, back to the main topic. This awful story is where Junko's name originates, and it's this story that encapsulates the energy that surrounds Sewerslvt's music. It's an aesthetic and sound built on trauma, dysphoria, and brutality. This is one of the main reasons why Sewerslvt is a polarizing name. The music is a reflection and embodiment of extreme distress and a deep abyss of depression, though it is this darkness that makes it so endearing and powerful. One has to look no further than the thumbnails for many of the videos and various singles and albums that they've released. I mean, just look at this. Did you expect love, hugs, and puppies? Now, with all that being said, let's talk about what would come to define the signature sound of Sewerslvt. " 2018 came and Junko dropped the eponymous self-titled EP, the true birth of the Sewerslvt sound that we know today, with the EP containing some of my favorite songs that they've ever released. The record is 10 tracks, 9 original songs, and a Daft Punk remix. Starting off with the opening song, Sewer, the tone is instantly set for the rest of the record, with a 4.5-minute runtime of ambience and white noise, stirring and breathing, creating an atmosphere of fear and anxiety. Bleeding straight into the next track, Sane, where we get introduced to some of the slow and heavy drums bathed in distortion, helping drive a massive and noisy bass, giving the song a gritty industrial feel, but with some extra corrosiveness to it, almost sounding like metal gears being eaten away by acid. All this is topped off with some chopped up female vocals, making the whole song sound like a disjointed nightmare. Following this comes the track Cute Panties Soaked in Arizona, giving us a taste of that trap element we saw so heavily featured on Don't Be Afraid of Dying. This time around with some very vaporwave style vocal samples covering over the track in its melancholic edge. It's a song that always makes me miss this sound, and it kind of makes me sad that Junko never really went back to it. But something they did go back to would be the sound of the next track, Pretty Cunt. The song booming with fast-paced drum and bass energy, almond break samples, and huge jungle basses. This being the first track to really embrace what would later become the signature sound of the project that we all know and love. I mean, come on, if you're a Sewerslvt fan and you don't love this song, the fuck is wrong with you? The album continues with an abrasive and almost dubstep-like remix of Daft Punk's classic Doing It Right. Another standout on the album comes a bit later with the track Oni, a masterpiece of ambience with its overwhelmingly gloomy pads guiding the track and being driven by some slow and heavy drums. This being another track really highlighting Junko's greatest talent, which is translating pain and dysphoria into beautiful and haunting music. The EP finishes off with 3 tracks: NTR Ending, Catharsis, and Slut. These tracks contain their own sound, with NTR being another dive into some breakcore influenced drum and bass, Catharsis being a slower ambient track, and Slut finishing off the album with a mid-tempo trap instrumental, closing the curtains on what has been a gloomy, oppressive, but cathartic record. The self-titled album is a true breath of fresh air, and while it's not as long, grand, or dark as some of Junko's later work, it's one of her most important, really giving us a taste of what was to come and laying down the groundwork of the aesthetic and sound that the project would carry going forward. Drowning in the Sewer was 2019's offering from Junko, and it's another massive step forward in their sound. The album is haunting, to say the least, with much more ambient textures this time around, as well as a heavier focus on late 90s style drum and bass, filled to the brim with samples from the PS2 and anime like Silent Hill and Serial Experiments Lane. The album also contains many legacy samples famous to use in drum and bass music, giving the entire project a much more mature feel and sounding like a love letter to the genre at large. My favorite songs off this album are Hopelessness, Lollybox, and 177013. Hopelessness is driven by an intense beat and ambient textures sampled from the song Peace and Serenity from Silent Hill 2. The track carries a somber yet peaceful aura and almost feels hopeful, as contradictory as that might sound, whereas Lollybox is much the opposite affair. It's a track similar in the fact that it also samples Silent Hill 2, but this time around it's the track The Day of Night. An already grim and solemn song, though here it's amped up to the extreme with a low grungy bass behind it being driven by some mid-tempo drums all sloshed together in a deep and cavernous reverb. I mean, just listen to this. The song's melancholic nature makes it something many people might want to avoid unless you're a masochist like myself. It's an absolute treat, and one of my personal favorite tracks Junko has to offer. 177013, a title that I'm sure is a reference, but it's one an uncultured dummy like me just doesn't get. The song is the closest we get to the sounds that we heard on the self-titled album and Don't Be Afraid of Dying, focusing on noisy production and some mild trap influence. The song also has a phenomenal shift midway through that just comes out of nowhere and takes you by surprise, encasing you in a slow but creeping ambience before jolting you into a barrage of noisy stabs and static. The last song worth going in depth about would be the album closer, Nothingness, a song that couldn't have any more fitting of a title. It's a 16-minute journey through ambient soundscapes, shifting and colliding, leading you down into a sea of harsh emotions and ever-engulfing depression. It really caps off the album with the feeling I believe it wanted to convey most. Drowning in a sewer, left with nothing but your thoughts and the knowledge that there really is no way out. This is the project I'm most excited to tell you about, because it's my favorite album Sewerslvt has put out to date. Draining Love Story is the second strongest piece of work that Junko has put out to the world, only being beaten by their latest release, We Had Some Good Times Together. Don't forget that. Draining Love Story was also the album that put Sewerslvt on the map for many people, with YouTube deciding to promote a few songs from the project and the algorithm ushering in an entirely new wave of listeners to the project. And while the album might be a good 20 minutes shorter than Drowning in the Sewer, it more than makes up for it with its gorgeous art and absolutely god-tier music. The album has a much more mature approach to its songwriting and a more mature approach to sound design. The first 2 tracks off the album demonstrate this in great effect with Love is a Mighty Word and New Love. The former is a short intro track and the latter serving as the album's introduction. New Love works well because it's more subdued than what we would expect, only to ramp up in its intensity as the song goes on, before dropping us into the album's 3rd track, Yandere Complex. I love this song. There's no real reason behind it besides it perfectly juggles its danceability with its melancholy. While Sewerslvt is a project defined by its aggression, it's a breath of fresh air to hear a more fun and lighthearted track built from the same parts. Though it's the track Lexapro Delirium that throws another curveball at us with its more minimal approach. Much like the drug itself, there is something hypnotic and haunting about the song, really living up to its name, and I mean, it's just fun. It's, again, another more lighthearted approach in such an aggressive project. Though if I had to pick my favorite track off this record, it would easily be Swinging in His Cell, an intense drum and bass track that pushes all the elements of anger and sadness to their absolute limit. The song is fantastic, dripping in emotion and energy, and for me, it's the best song off the record. Although for most, their favorite song would be the next track, the legendary Mr. Kill Myself, a song that has gone on to receive an asinine amount of views and did a lot of the groundwork in gaining Junko the following that they have today. It's a fantastic song with its dynamic and energetic style. It's no surprise it's gone on to be the massive hit that it's become. Also, its single artwork is one to behold. The final track off the record is another one of its better offerings, Slow Death. It's a phenomenal closing track, creating an almost sweet-sounding ambiance to accompany the breakbeats and groovy bass lines that make up the track. Just a final curveball for the listeners as the record closes itself off, and one that in my opinion shows just how special this release really was. Draining Love Story would go on to do amazing numbers and elevate Sewerslvt from a rising cult star to near mainstream success, although this nearly overnight success may have been a bit of a double-edged sword, with Junko frequently posting about their worsening mental health and personal instability. This eventually became less and less frequent as they continued to put out more music and detach themselves from social media, though their music would continue to escalate in its themes of mental degradation and suffering. It was also after their massive success with the album that a new wave of more skeptical and vicious listeners would begin to show up, delving into Junko's online history and some of their more edgy statements online, leading to a Kiwi Farms thread and a large wave of hate and scrutiny due to some of their greasier activities. That being said, I'm not going in depth on any of this stuff. If you want to know more about it, I recommend this video. A dive into this would take an entire video of its own, and I only really mention it because it's important for the context of Junko's output going forward. After Draining Love Story's success, Sewerslvt put out a metric fuck ton of music until their final record in late 2021. And while none of it was bad per se, there was definitely a quantity over quality approach to their output. The standout being the I Really Love You EP, taking and expanding a lot of the sounds on Draining Love Story, and the low point being The World Is Fucked. And while I might not be covering these, I don't think they're bad. Actually, I absolutely love Schizophrenia Simulation, but for this video, I think we should focus on their final album because it takes all the things I would have talked about with the previous releases and perfects them, creating what, in my opinion, is the definitive Sewerslvt album. We Had Some Good Times Together, Don't Forget That, was released in December of 2021 after two fantastic EPs comprised of songs off the record were released. And this album is a 90-minute monster of a project, taking nearly every sound we've heard Junko play with at this point and fuse them together to create one of the most dysphoric and dark electronic albums I have ever heard. I mean, for fuck's sake, the album starts off like this. But don't be fooled, the gorgeous and dreamy sounds make their appearance on the very same track as well. This intro track is perfect in this regard because it shows off the balancing act that makes up the meat of this album. And given the themes and background behind it, it's no surprise. We Had Some Good Times is an album built on grief. And for the sake of example, I'm going to talk about 5 tracks off the album that I believe reflect all 5 of grief's stages. For Denial, we have to look no further than track 2, Self-Destruction Worldwide Broadcast. While it might have a gruesome title, the track itself radiates a melancholic joy. The feeling that comes when you're doing your best to smile and be happy while denying the painful emotions you're trying so hard to bury. The track itself reminds me a lot of Porter Robinson's Virtual Self project, and that's a good thing. The dynamic chord structure and the overly emotional piano sounds that make it sound like it's straight out of an anime OST is just a pleasure to disassociate to. When it comes to anger, I think the best track to pick here would be Borderline. To be fair, a large chunk of this record carries anger with it, but no track does it as explicitly as Borderline. The track has a thick fog of distorted ambience, constantly shifting and moving, making every inch of the song sound as painful and agonizing as possible. If they ever made a Manhunt 3, this should be the theme song, because the murderous anger and rage that radiates from it perfectly exemplifies the feeling of playing that game. For stage number 3 of Grief, we have Bargaining, with the track Blissful Overdose. And while the track that precedes it, Whatever, has a more upbeat and cheery tone in comparison, it feels more like a reprieve than actual bargaining, whereas Blissful Overdose sounds like this. The track is constantly shifting back and forth from intense anger with its acid-style lead in production, to outright desperation when it kicks into a faster tempo, sounding like a panic attack, or sounding like desperate bargaining. The final 2 songs off this album are great stand-ins for our final 2 stages, with the song Her being Depression and Goodbye being Acceptance. Her is a great song and a good break from the intensity of the rest of the album. It's definitely not light by any means, but it lets the sadness really show with its beautiful but somber soundscapes. Though it's the 17-minute behemoth of a song, Goodbye, that takes the cake on this album in terms of thematic power. It's hard to sum up Goodbye in words because it truly is an experience you have to hear to understand, but it's the main reason I chose to theme this album's breakdown after the 5 stages of grief, because it kind of goes through all 5 stages on its own, as well as, well, like I said, it's extremely conclusive, and a fitting track to not only end the album on, but one to wave goodbye to the audience with.
was just on another planet. Wonder if this is what it's like to be Buster.
When do they stop tuning their instruments and play the music?
I have no proof that this is really goodbye for the Sewerslvt project, but given that this has been the longest period without a release from Junko, and the conclusive and thematic nature of "we had some good times," I'm just gonna go out on a limb and accept that it's their farewell, at least for now. Sewerslvt is a name that's been riddled with controversies since the word go, and given how divisive their public perception has been over the years and the allegations that have been levied against them, I wouldn't be surprised if they rebrand under a new name and start over. But if they ever did return to bring us more music, it wouldn't surprise me either. Junko is one of the most terminally online people I think I've ever seen, at least as a musician. Regardless, they left us a ton of great music, and their influence has reached far and wide since that fateful day that YouTube decided to push Mr. Kill Myself to the greater world. But for the life that they helped spark back into the electronic scene, and the breath of fresh air that was their sound, they definitely earned a legacy. But with that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter. I'll see you in the next video.
It's me, Madison Ray, playing up your pathetic little babe pitties.